Hello, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and begin our panel on the crisis of global liberalism. It's wonderful to see so many folks out here from student body, from faculty, colleagues, from community members, members of our conference and workshop that have been meeting for the last couple of days. I want to begin by thanking our partners in organizing this, Reset Dialogues on Civilizations, or Reset Dialogues, which is a wonderful organization that has been sponsoring a number of events related to the question of liberalism in all of its manifestations in various global contexts, and also trying to promote dialogue. So the goal, as you'd expect from the name Reset Dialogues, is to try to get civilizations not to clash, but to talk to one another. And that's involved a long set of discussions about political philosophy and about democracy and about human rights and about international relations that Reset has been sponsoring in a number of global capitals in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Europe, in Russia post-communist region, and now in North America as well. So it's a wonderful partnership. I'd like in particular to thank Giancarlo Bossetti, who's here in the second row, and he has been sort of the mastermind behind Reset. So we at the Reves Center for International Studies, we find it a very natural partnership since we too are devoted to topics of global importance and discussing those in a tolerant spirit at a place like William & Mary that's been involved in leading intellectual exchanges on a global scale for well over 3 centuries now. We forget that in addition to being famous US presidents, folks like Thomas Jefferson or John Marshall were also world intellectuals, and the discussions that they were sponsoring here in Williamsburg had global resonance and continue to have global resonance. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers as they start, but it's going to be a little bit unorthodox because I'm also a presenter today. And I decided that since I'm presenting and organizing, those are 2 different parts of the brain. I guess left and right would be the 2 types. And so better for me to give my presentation first and then move into the more administrative role. So with apologies to my colleagues for sort of usurping the starting point, each of us are going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then that will leave half an hour for questions and discussion from the audience on this topic of the future of the global liberal order, just minor stuff we like to discuss. So let me go ahead and begin. So where are we in terms of the fate of the global liberal order? What does that actually mean would be obviously the first question we'd want to ask. I think of it in terms of a famous political scientist named John Ruggie, who made the argument that most of the institutions that are now organizing world politics, military affairs, economic trade, and the like, have what he called an embedded liberalism to them. Embedded liberalism, according to Ruggie, didn't mean that people sat out to sort of design or set out to design each institution according to some strict constitutional principle of liberal order or to reflect faithfully classical liberal principles, but instead that just the very fact that the United States was the victor after World War II and world institutions were designed in the context of the United States having hegemonic or near hegemonic power at the very beginning, and then being the sole alternative to the Soviet Union for the Cold War, it meant that the liberal founding principles, and we're talking here about John Locke and classical liberalism, that were embedded in the US constitutional order were sort of naturally then thought through as models, as exemplars for world institutions, whether those be alliances like NATO, whether those be economic institutions like the Bretton Woods currency institutions, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the WTO or World Trade Organization. In a very different and complicated way, the European Union, which is not a US-based organization, still did draw inspiration from these kinds of principles of liberal constitutionalism. Some would argue for a United States of Europe. It, of course, isn't that. But there were those kinds of references in the early debates about how to unite Europe in a transnational order. And of course, if we think about the United Nations, it's interesting, Emory Reves, whose center I direct now, named after Emory Reves, he wanted a global liberal constitutional state. He thought the United Nations would be too weak to actually manage peace and security for the whole planet after the disasters of World War II. What we got instead was the United Nations. He saw it as too weak, a compromise, but still obviously organized around rule of law principles, a UN Charter, Declaration of Universal Human Rights. And so the question of how the global liberal order is now faring really is about those institutions of embedded liberalism. I think we can be specific about it. Well, They're not doing that well. I think if we really have to go down the list here, we have to say that none of those institutions are in very clear or strong shape. Starting with the military dimension, in NATO, we have first the direct attacks on allies from the United States about payment. One could make the case that payments for military budgets should be higher, but the rhetoric has been very, very difficult to hear on the allies' side. We have a lot of confusion about what the mutual defense arrangements of NATO mean in the context of an incredibly uncertain situation in the former Soviet space, Ukraine being a good example. Of course, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but the fact that Ukraine borders so many NATO states and countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which are NATO members, are looking every day to Ukraine to sort of see what the implications are for their security. It means that there's just a lot of anxiety in the alliance about exactly whether the United States will keep its pledge to fight for the borders, for example, of Estonia and Russia in the event of an attack. We can add to that the Turkish dimension, which now becomes incredibly complicated because Turkey is a NATO member and nevertheless is buying anti-aircraft missiles from Russia against the objections of the United States, but nevertheless calling into question the way in which the NATO sort of hegemony has been managed for many, many decades. If we move from military affairs, oh, and I should have added arms control, sorry, not part of NATO, obviously, but arms control treaties, which were another kind of legal architecture of the international order for the last several decades. Between Russia and the United States, there's essentially no agreements left. The last one, New START, which limits the number of nuclear warheads to 1,500 on each side, is set to expire in 2020. It's basically decided on both sides. There's no chance to renew that because there's not enough time for the lawyers and the verification people to get together and figure out what that extension would look like. The INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, has already been abrogated. So that architecture of security is also no longer really operative or hanging by a thread. On the question of trade, those institutions too of embedded liberalism are very, very uncertain at the moment. The kind of invocation of security concerns by the United States to lobby tariffs against allies like Canada or EU members, that's also been very offensive to the folks on the other side of that argument. Not so much the tariffs themselves, which of course have their own opponents, but the fact that the United States would say it's an issue of national security vis-a-vis Canada, for example, that those tariffs be implemented. It makes people feel that the kind of US guarantee of the global trading system isn't that dependable anymore. And this unfortunately comes at a time when there had already been a failure after the Doha round of the World Trade Organization to push forward with further lowering of tariff barriers to support global trade. If we add China-US relations to the mix, quite clear that the US-led trade regime of the old order is very much in question. We could go on and on. Time is short. We could add, of course, just yesterday, the formal decision of the United States to depart from the Paris Climate Accords, which would take place 1 year from today, interestingly enough, just before elections next year, and increasing sort of unwillingness to refer to international human rights treaties in US diplomacy. And this, of course, has, again, ramifications for our allies and for the institutional structures of the United Nations more generally. So then, if we would agree, and I think this is an objective point, whether you like the liberal order, don't like the liberal order, I imagine in the audience there are people on both sides of that, very hard to argue that it's as strong as it was, several years ago. So why did that happen? I want to make the argument in the brief time I have that the way to understand this is to take a step back and look at a famous theory. All of my colleagues know I'm going to say this. A famous theory by German sociologist Max Weber, the most brilliant social scientist ever. Weber had a key argument that I think is key to understanding the global liberal order and its fate, and that is, when you really get right down to it, there are only 3 ways to organize political power legitimately in human history. There just aren't that many options out there. Weber argued one option is tradition, traditional legitimacy or domination, Herrschaft. Traditional order is when you order things by the way things have always been, at least as you argue that they've always been. It's often patrimonial authority that is ruled by the head of the household, usually male, and the children obey the parents or the father. That's the model for political order. If you can make the case that you're the father of the entire nation and get people to obey you on the basis of that kind of tradition that you create, then you can have traditional legitimacy, meaning the state agents, the political actors, feel like they have a duty to obey the czar, or to obey the emperor, or to obey the head of the household or the head of the tribe, because tradition demands that kind of order. So that's type number 1. Type number 2, Weber used a kind of inelegant phrase. He said it's rational legal order, basically rule of law, but it means you have impersonal procedures and rules to decide which orders you should obey, right? So if you have a constitutional order that says the presidential office shall be elected by the electors through the Electoral College, and it's every 4 years, you have the elections and that's the term limit. You know, that too is a way of organizing political power that people can feel is legitimate, that is, they have a duty to obey it, very different from traditional order, which depends on personal relationships and instead, you know, is based on impersonal proceduralism, with the idea that the personal quality is usually taken out of it as much as you possibly can. Finally, and the only other type, is charismatic leadership, in which you obey the authority because it seems like it's extraordinary, straight from God, heaven's word on earth. If you think the person who's giving you an order is God's representative, typically you will obey, and you'll do so feeling it's a duty. And that can create all sorts of political power in the short run. Weber argued that kind of charismatic authority is typically ephemeral. It doesn't last that long because by the time, you know, people get used to it, the miraculous quality tends to decay, to routinize, as he said, to become routine. And so then eventually it may turn into one of the other two types. It could turn into a traditional lineage, if, for example, the son takes over from the charismatic father, or it could turn into a legal order if the principles of the founding, which are seen as extraordinary, become the basis of a constitutional order. That would be the US case in the Revolution, obviously simplifying. Now, what Weber didn't argue is that those same 3 types of legitimate domination are actually also the only 3 ways you can organize the global order. This is my contribution to the debate. There are 3 types and only 3 types. If you want to set about organizing rules for the global system, which is on the agenda, you know, whether we like it or not, we got to figure out how to organize this. You could do it through traditional authority, which means you have a lot of lineages, you have a lot of empires, you have a lot of patrimonial leaders, and they basically have a fuzzy understanding of their boundaries, because boundaries too are given by history and tradition, which is contested by what people claim to be their historic territory, and not by a legal delineation of borders which are clear and consistent and settled by treaty demarcation. That, of course, would be the second type of way to organize the global order, which is the rational legal way, and that's the embedded liberalism of the post-war period. That's where you have constitutional and treaty norms and procedures to figure out who gets in the country, who doesn't get in the country, who gets a passport or a visa, who doesn't. If everything's done in an impersonal, legal manner, with personal lineages seen to be secondary, then people can feel that they're legitimately enforcing those rules, even if sometimes they have to give up a little bit, you know, of other values to do it. And then you have a world that looks sort of ordered in terms of the colors on the map being, you know, clear, and people know when those countries are then superseded by supranational authority like the European Union. Finally, you can have charismatic revisioning of the world order. That's what people like Lenin and Stalin and Hitler were trying to do, and I would add Baghdadi or Osama bin Laden before him. These are notions of the future in which the entire planet is re-envisioned as a place timeless, spaceless, miraculously transformed. I put it in quotes because obviously I'm not endorsing these people morally, but the point is analytically it's a third category. These charismatic leaders who want to change world order don't do it to create new rules that would be enforceable and impersonal, and they don't do it just to create new lineages or traditions. They do it to destroy all the traditions and destroy all the rules and create something completely new. And by the way, usually accompanied by a huge amount of bloodshed. I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to tell you how that all happened. Why did we end up moving from rational legal order to, I would argue, increasingly patrimonial traditional notions of world order? First of all, the key point is there's only 3 types. People who attack the global liberal order might want to think about other ways to organize the world in rational legal ways. Because if you don't have an alternative, you're likely to get charismatic or traditional order by default. You're likely to get one of the other types. I think it started because in the wake of the triumph of the United States in the Cold War and the notion that history had ended with the victory of a kind of liberal, rational, legal world, you ended up with the losers from that settlement feeling increasingly upset, not just about the rational legal world order itself, but increasingly upset that they thought it was really just a hypocritical mask for US power and the interests of a very wealthy elite. That was felt acutely throughout the former communist world, and particularly in Russia, in the Russian Federation, which was the key loser, obviously. Russians hate it when you say that. They say we co-won the Cold War because we overthrew communism just as much as you did. But the reality was that in the 1990s, the Russian economy collapsed. It was half as big as it was at the beginning of the same era. And by the time Putin came to power, most Russians, and I mean a majority in public opinion polls, would insist that the liberal world order, quote unquote, democracy, human rights, these institutional treaties, NATO, European Union expansion, were all basically a fake designed to keep Russia down and allow the United States to steal Russian raw materials, especially oil. Of course, again, I'm not endorsing any of that point of view. What I'm saying is that the initial source of anger, resentment, and a desire to point out the liberal world order as a hypocritical kind of facade emerged from Russia. And Putin himself has been incredibly skillful in tapping into those emotions wherever you find them in the entire world, not because he personally created all that reaction, he didn't, but because he knew himself how he and many people around him could make the case that what looks like liberal rules and legal procedures for organizing world power is just really in the interest of a small group of transnational elites who don't understand the perspectives of marginalized people. Who would have thought that that ideological argument for essentially a patrimonial traditional alternative to the liberal order would be successful not only in post-communist countries or in the developing world, but in the core parts of the liberal order itself, in forgotten communities, in places that felt that the United States itself had adopted a kind of liberalism that was out of touch with their community traditions and their community spirituality. So ironically, what seemed like a marginal response from Russia's defeat in the Cold War to attack the ideological principles of liberal order has turned into a powerful ideological wave that has swept over region after region after region. And hence we have the situation I described. So I'll conclude by saying, we are clearly at a point of, there's no doubt in my mind, we're at a major historical turning point. I think everybody knows that. But the turning point is not decided yet, because even though all those liberal orders that I just talked about are in various ways weakened or hanging by a thread, they're still the architecture of the world system to this moment. And the architecture that comes afterward looks very different. In fact, for the moment, you can have leaders as different as Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia or Duterte in the Philippines or any number of others we could mention, Orban in Hungary, feel like they have common cause because they're all attacking the remnants of the global liberal order. But the moment that global liberal order is actually gone, you will see quickly that the interests of Turkey and Russia are not aligned, the interests of Turkey and Hungary are not aligned, et cetera, et cetera. The old patrimonial order that came before liberal order was not exactly a very stable thing. It tended to produce a lot of violence, particularly on the edges of empires. And I don't know exactly what that looks like in the technologically advanced 21st century, but it's possible we'll find out. Oh, and I get to introduce Sheri. Thank you, thank you. That was the intellectual cap going off. Now the organizational cap goes on. I'd like to welcome my wonderful colleague, Sheri Berman. She is a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. Her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism, and fascism, and the history of the left. She has written about these topics for a wide variety of scholarly and non-scholarly publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and Vox. She currently serves on the boards of the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science Quarterly, and her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship, From the Ancien Régime to the Present Day, is out from Oxford University Press, wonderful book, which you should all read. She has her MA and PhD in government from Harvard University and her BA in political science magna cum laude, and with distinction from Yale University. So, Professor Berman.
Well, so I have my entire CV now out on the table. So thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here and impressed that there are so many people interested in talking about the crisis of liberalism on such a beautiful November day. So we're here to talk about the crisis of liberalism. I'm going to talk about that in a slightly different way than my colleague Professor Hanson did. For me, what the crisis of liberalism most evokes is declining faith in or support for liberal democracy. And I'm going to talk about that particularly in the West because that's the part of the world that I know best. So this is an extremely complex and complicated question. Why is it that we have seen declining support for liberal democracy in the West today? And so what I'd like to do as a sort of social scientist is lay out a little bit what some of the key approaches are to answering this question, what some of the key findings or arguments of social scientists are. So let me start with the most obvious one and the most popular one, and that kind of answer to why people are losing faith in liberal democracy focuses on economic changes and focuses on people's economic grievances and resentments and demands. So this one is, I'm sure, familiar to probably everybody in the audience today. It focuses on how Western economies have changed over the last decades. So we've seen in Western Europe and the United States in the late 20th and early 21st century slowing levels of growth, rising inequality, declining social mobility, increasing divisions between successful coastal cities and more left behind rural and peripheral areas. And all of these things, it is said, has created citizens who feel resentful, who feel aggrieved, who feel left behind, and are therefore not as supportive of liberal democracy, which they believe has not, again, responded to their particular interests. So in this view, a lot of the declining faith in democracy comes from, again, people who have been left behind by the economic trends of the past decades. Another kind of explanation focuses less on economic trends and economic grievances and demands and focuses more on social and cultural trends and on social and cultural grievances and demands. In this view, right, the real problem has been the way demographics are changing in Western societies. In the United States, for instance, we hear a lot about the rise of a majority-minority society. That is to say that white folks are no longer going to be a majority of the population. In Western Europe, the debate is much more about rising levels of immigration. We've also seen in the United States the mobilization of minority groups and women, and many people feel like over the last decades, more generally, traditional values have been under threat. And together, cumulatively, the argument goes, this has made many people feel insecure, like their concerns and their needs are not being addressed, and they've therefore, again, kind of lost faith in liberal democracy because it, and in particular the elites who run it, are seen as kind of less responsive to their concerns and their demands. Now, those two kinds of explanations are not mutually exclusive. A lot of people have focused on the way in which social and economic trends have interacted. Surely it is the case, for instance, that in bad economic times, in times of rising economic insecurity, it's easier to scapegoat people. It's easier to focus on divisions in society rather than things that unite us. It's much easier, again, for people to become disaffected and feel as if they are not being listened to. So again, one way of thinking about why we've seen declining support for liberal democracy is to focus on what's been happening to citizens, why some voters are more discontented or aggrieved. Social scientists like to call these demand-side explanations because they focus on the demands of citizens and whether or not they are being addressed. Other types of ways of approaching this problem about the crisis of liberalism looks not so much at the way citizens' demands and grievances have changed, but look at liberal democratic institutions themselves. So here the question is, well, why over the past decades have our parties, our politicians, and our governments not been successful in responding to citizens' demands, right? Citizens only become resentful and aggrieved if their parties and politicians and governments don't actually respond to them. So why is it, therefore, from this perspective, that, again, democratic institutions have not been responsive, right? That's the job of democracy, right? Democracy is supposed to respond to citizen and voter demands. And here again, we have a whole variety of interesting kinds of insights. So in the United States, again, probably folks are very aware of debates about things like gerrymandering, which have really shaped the way that different politicians have to respond to citizens, right? The more homogenous your voters are, the less need you have to be responsive to people outside of that sort of narrow group. The rise, the increase in lobbying, and the fact that lobbying is disproportionately carried out by wealthy folks, businesses, and corporations, right? The idea here being, again, that political activity is skewed by that. We've had, over the past decades, an incredible rise in the private funding of political candidates. That is to say, rather than funding coming from political parties, they're coming from private actors in society. These private actors have also played an increasingly important role in agenda setting in the United States. That is to say, in funneling particular kinds of research and policy proposals to politicians, right, coming from private actors rather than from civil society groups or parties more generally. Very different, very interesting changes in who runs for office, partially as a result of some of these trends. Very, very few, for instance, working class people run for office in the United States. Why is this important? Because we know actually that working class politicians have different preferences from other types of politicians, particularly on, for example, economic issues, right? So again, all of these things cumulatively in the United States perhaps are helping to make our democratic institutions less responsive. In Europe, in addition to some of these similar kinds of trends, folks have also talked a lot about the growing importance of the European Union, taking powers away from national governments, putting them at the regional level where they are less subject to, less responsive to democratic procedures. Also going along with this has been the incredible judicialization of politics in the European Union. That is to say, more and more decisions also being made by courts rather than by democratically elected leaders and governments. And again, all of these things combining, it is said, to make democratic governments and politicians less responsive to their citizens, right? So we've seen in this view over the last decades, right, cumulative trends that have made parties, politicians, and governments less responsive to their citizens, less able to deal with the challenges that their societies face, and this has therefore led to growing dissatisfaction with democracy. Social scientists like to call those types of explanations, by the way, supply-side explanations in comparison to the demand-side ones, because the main focus of attention is on the institutions that are supposed to supply responses to citizens and societal challenges. Also important in thinking about the crisis of liberalism is looking at what political actors themselves have done over the past year. So what issues, what interests, and what identities dominate political competition? These are largely determined by political actors themselves. What things politicians stress, what things parties stress. And so some social scientists have spent a lot of time thinking about how political actors have changed the way they deal with, appeal to, speak to voters over the past years. Not surprisingly, much attention has been paid to populist politicians and parties who very much focus on fear-based, negative kinds of appeals. They very much are pessimistic parties. They very much focus on things that worry citizens, whether it's the changes that I've talked about before, growing immigration, crime, decline of national values, the sort of corruption of the elite, and all of these kinds of things. And again, the argument here is that constantly focusing on these kinds of fear-based issues, constantly focusing on these divisive issues, that these have really, again, increased polarization in society and increased dissatisfaction with democracy. So again, we have lots of different kinds of ways of thinking about why we've seen perhaps declining support for liberal democracy over the past years. And let me, because I've been told that I only have a few minutes left, let me end by asking, though, even though there's clearly a lot of problems that we face today, and even though there's lots of trends that we can think about as being behind what is clearly growing discontent and dissatisfaction, the term crisis is a pretty strong one. It indicates not only that the problem is serious, but that it might be on some level unprecedented. And I think that it's important to kind of consider whether or not that is actually the case, not only because terminology is kind of, it's important to be exact about those kinds of things, but because the more serious, the more crisis-like we see our situation as being, the more the types of approaches to that the types of approaches that we take to our problems will depend partially on how severe we think the problems actually are. For instance, there's lots of debates going on in the United States and in Western societies more generally about whether or not we need to stick to the rules of the game, whether or not the threats that we face are so serious as to think about sort of new techniques or new approaches to dealing with politics. And as a historically minded social scientist, I want to say that it may be the case that even though our problems are serious, they are not quite at the crisis level. It was not that long ago, in the late 1970s, for instance, that you would, if you were a student at William and Mary or at any other place, read books like the one put out by the Trilateral Commission called The Crisis of Democracy, which, coming on the heels of the 1960s, talked about how democracy was becoming overwhelmed, societies were becoming ungovernable, and we were faced with a kind of, again, existential threat to the future. In 1984, just before the collapse of the Soviet, well, a few years before the collapse of the Soviet Empire, one of the absolute greatest democratic theorists of the second half of the 20th century, truly an incredibly insightful social scientist named Robert Dahl, wrote an article claiming that it was a disagreeable, perhaps even tragic fact that in much of the world, the conditions most favorable to the development and maintenance of democracy are non-existent or at best only weakly present. And again, a few years after that, the third wave would really just flood across not just the Soviet Empire, but other parts of the globe. So it may be the case that while we are facing some serious challenges today, again, very serious economic challenges, very serious social and cultural change, some real problems in the responsiveness and effectiveness of our democratic institutions, we may be facing one of those sort of periodic cycles in the history of democracy, perhaps not unlike the 1960s, again a time of incredible fervor, incredible uprising, incredible discontent. Remember, that was a time also when we had much more violence, even domestic violence in some ways than we do today, serious domestic terrorism in Europe in particular, right? But the system managed to recalibrate, not perfectly, but enough so that liberal democracy then went on, as we know, in the 70s and in the 80s, to an era when it thought that it was once again triumphant. So what we may be experiencing today is one of those cycles, again, where things are out of whack, but hopefully where liberal democracy will be able to recalibrate, perhaps if we all are able to think a little bit more carefully about what our problems actually are and how we might successfully deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheri. Terrific. Our next speaker is Professor Jenny White. She's Professor of Turkish Studies at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies. She has written numerous articles on Turkey and lectures internationally on topics ranging from political Islam and civil society to ethnic identity and gender issues. She is the former president of the Turkish Studies Association and of the American Anthropological Association Middle East section. She has received numerous grants and fellowships from, among others, the Social Science Research Council, the MacArthur Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and Fulbright Hays. And she's a prolific author, including books like Muslim Nationalists and the New Turks from Princeton University Press, Islamist Mobilization in Turkey, A Study in Vernacular Politics, which was the winner of the 2003 Douglas Prize for Best Book in Europeanist Anthropology, and Money Makes Us Relatives, Women's Labor in Urban Turkey. And all of her books have been translated into Turkish. She has also written 3 historical novels set in 19th century Istanbul, The Sultan Seal, The Abyssinian Proof, and The Winter Thief. And The Sultan Seal, which has been translated into 15 languages, was named one of the top 10 first novels of 2006 by Booklist, shortlisted for the 2006 Ellis Peters Historical Crime Award. Her PhD is from the University of Texas, Austin. And take it away, Jenny. Oh, push the button on the front. It's right here. You just slip it up. Okay.
Hello. Technology is not on my list of skills. So I just want to say that I may be a professor of Turkish studies, but I'm actually a social anthropologist in real life, which means that my account will be slightly different from the previous accounts. I work on Turkey in particular, but I thought that it would be interesting for those of you who were not present at our wonderful day and a half of really intensive discussion for me to pick out, like picking out the raisins out of the cake, pick out some of the things, the insights that various people made that I found particularly thought-provoking, so that you have a sense of that rather than just talking about Turkey, which may or may not interest you. I will get back to Turkey later because it's an interesting instance of a country that has had democratic elections, free and fair democratic elections since 1950 until very recently, but has never been liberal. So what does that say about democracy? Anyway, I'll get back to that. So aside from ideologies and forms of governance, which I don't deal with quite that much in my field, what I do deal with is something that came up over and over in the our conference. That is that people have real problems. I mean, it sounds simple enough. The economy, employment, social inequalities. Professor Berman mentioned this as well. And they want real responses from their institutions. And in fact, one of our participants, Sharan Grewal, talked about how the new president of Tunisia was one of two candidates who came out of nowhere. And in the poll that he made before the election to see why people chose these two people, and one of them actually won, is now the new president, the absolute top thing was that people had economic problems and they wanted help. So what's interesting to me is the role of institutions in this, because for different reasons, institutions of the state are often unwilling to respond or unable to respond to these needs. And so in Turkey, these institutions, since 1923, there have been institutions that have been basically colonized by the party in power, and the party in power was was one party only. There were no elections until 1950, but there was still a kind of professionalism. I mean, you basically represented the ideas of this party, but you still had to get a degree and know what you were doing. So there was that element of professionalism, but the things that these institutions did were basically all top-down. There was no listening to the citizens. The citizens were defined as having duties to the state and to the nation, but not rights. And to this day, the constitution, the most recent constitution of Turkey, doesn't really give the citizen rights. The state has the rights, and the citizen is supposed to just obey. So it was this kind of top-down, and it's not something that you would object to if you're a liberal, right? Because it was a westernization program. So women were given the vote, they were able to be elected to parliament, legal system was taken from Europe, lots of other westernization kinds of things, but the majority of the country was conservative and religious. So in some sense, this was an imposition on the population, even though you might say that it had a kind of liberal cast to it. But the institutions were not supposed to be responding. You had a leader. In the beginning, it was Kemal Ataturk. And now we have another leader who's the head of a party and who recently changed the constitution to basically take all power into his hands. This is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the present president of Turkey. So, the thread of authoritarianism goes all the way through to the beginning. The thread of institutions being the machinery of the state, really, rather than anything that was supposed to listen to citizens' desires. That's also something that goes through to the beginning. what has changed radically, though, is the extent to which the institutions themselves have been de-bureaucratized. That is, the professionalism is no longer part of it. The people, you hire your nephew, who may or may not know anything about the job that he has been given. And this sort of, deprofessionalization of the institutions means that people just have absolutely no recourse whatsoever, except to go out on the street. And going out on the street has, as anyone who's watched the news, has had kind of dire effects. And there's also a lot of repression, and people are arrested and thrown in prison for retweeting something critical of the president, or even that would put Turkish economy in a bad light. So there's no more rule of law at all. So this is a real kind of decline of the institutional aspect of Turkey, even though they still have elections. And they had one recently, which is quite interesting. It was the elections for mayors, the mayors of the major cities in Turkey. And Istanbul is, it's the majority of the income, the national income comes through Istanbul. It's sort of the financial center of everything. And the government, in order to keep all these patronage networks satisfied, has been relying on the income through building projects, especially ones in Istanbul, to feed these networks. And lo and behold, in this election, which had been won by the ruling AKP party for several elections in a row, went to the opposition. So in order not to lose Istanbul, the president decided the election should be rerun, which I think irritated a lot of people who saw the ability to cast a vote and have it be counted as one of the last things remaining to the citizen. And so in the second election that repeated the first, the opposition candidate got even more votes and is now the mayor of Istanbul. But it's sort of like dogs barking, going after the mayor. They're always coming up with new schemes to try to make sure he can't really govern. So the most recent scheme is to take away his right to make any decisions about what is built on the banks of the Bosphorus, which is the most valuable real estate, and give that to the presidency, basically, to decide. So that, just to cut off his income, make it ungovernable. And the other option that is still on the table is to do what the government has been doing with their Kurdish elected mayors throughout the country, which is just to get rid of them, not get rid of them that way, but just to remove them and replace them with somebody that the government just appoints. So the question is in the air, will they do that to the mayor of Istanbul, who has won this election twice? So this is the situation in Turkey. And when it comes to economic problems, there are also huge problems that the economy is not in very good shape. People can't afford food. So it's the makings of a kind of disaster. And so the question is, what can you do with a system like that, right? There is, all right, I have only 5 minutes. I knew I shouldn't have started talking about Turkey. So my point is that we had been talking now for 2 days about liberal democracies becoming illiberal and what can be done about it. So here we have a democracy that was never liberal and has become autocratic, but they still have the same issues that have to be resolved, right? That the government has to somehow listen to the people. I think in order for any kind of stability to occur, that has to happen. And the place where the government meets the people are these institutions, which, so the only way to do that, I think, in Turkey is to bureaucratize them again, right? Not hire your nephew, but hire professionals who are then empowered to deal with whatever issues they come up with. But the other thing that has to be done is citizens have to learn to speak to the institutions, right? And if they don't feel like they have rights, then they're not going to go to the institutions and demand their rights. And the answer to that, I think, lies in the youth, because half of the population of Turkey is under 30, and there are enormous changes occurring there, which doesn't mean they're getting liberal. It just means that they're learning that they have rights. And they're learning this in part because they have been exposed now through this government, which was open to the world economy, and for a long time, the internet was freely available. It is no longer. People were able to travel for the first time since 1980. Before then, it was a very closed society. So this generation has grown up having the same kinds of, desires for upward mobility and travel and choice that they see other people around the world having. And Turkey's not set up for that. So youth at the moment have no voice. I mean, they're not really a force in politics, but they can go out on the street, although that has been brutally repressed. But eventually they'll get older. And this generation, especially the ones who are, it's affected even the youth who are religious, right? So many people think that in Turkey all of this problem has to do with, an Islamic government. But in fact, it's a government that uses Islam to stay in power. And that in itself has caused young pious people to reject the government's use of Islam, and there is this movement among young people to choose how to be a Muslim. It's the very first time they are ever able to do that. And a whole industry has grown up around, setting up choices of fashions and activities that you can choose from to be a modern Muslim. And it's the choice aspect that they say makes us modern. We may look like Aunt Aisha down the street, who also wears a headscarf, but she does it out of tradition. We chose it, therefore we're modern. So the whole idea of choice is very important. And there's another trend that has people very worried in Turkey, the government and the religious institutions, and that is that there seems to be a movement among young people towards deism. That is, they're rejecting Islam or any kind of formal religion. They're not joining religious organizations, but they're believers in God, but they're not, it's not exactly what the government had in mind for an Islamic generation. And they may also be rejecting, there's some evidence that they're rejecting the kind of, these ideological groupings that their parents belong to. So they reject Islamism, they reject, leftism, rightism. They're not an ism generation. They're interested in issues rather than ideology. So we'll see where that takes us as the way out that I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And we now turn for our final speaker. I have a wonderful bio here on the reverse side of my time indicators. And this is M. Stephen Fish. Steve Fish is a comparative political scientist who studies democracy and regime change in developing and post-communist countries, religion and politics, and constitutional systems and national legislatures. Professor Fish is the author of Are Muslims Distinctive? A Look at the Evidence from Oxford Press 2011, which was selected for Choice's Outstanding Academic Titles 2012. He is also author of Democracy Derailed in Russia, The Failure of Open Politics from Cambridge in 2005, also a recipient of a Best Book Award by the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association. Democracy from Scratch, Opposition and Regime in the New Russian Revolution from Princeton 1995, which is really one of the pioneering books in our field. Steve and I go way back because we're both Soviet and Russia specialists. He's the co-author of the Handbook of National Legislatures, a global study, survey, I should say, which is one of the databases that every political scientist knows and continues to use. And Steve and I actually had the chance to co-author back in 2001 with a couple of other authors, a book called Post-Communism and the Theory of Democracy, Princeton 2001. Fish has served as a senior Fulbright Fellow and visiting professor at the Airlangga University in Surabaya, Indonesia. He has been at the European University of St. Petersburg in St. Petersburg, Russia. In 2005, he was the recipient of the Distinguished Social Sciences Teaching Award at UC Berkeley. His PhD is from Stanford University and an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as a BA from Cornell University. So with no further ado, Steve, if you can take us home.
Thanks, Steve. What I'd like to do is try to pull together some of the themes from our conference and revisit some of the big questions that we've been looking at. It strikes me that I agree with Sheri, actually. I don't think we're yet in a full-blown crisis of liberalism. So the question now for us is how to avoid entering that full-blown crisis stage. And it seems to me like the big problem is that liberals are losing elections sometimes. Some people who we assumed whose vote we could assume would always go to candidates who supported liberal values, and by liberal I mean from Bernie Sanders to Ronald Reagan here, liberal in the classical sense, meaning people who take seriously rights and limits on government power, human equality and the rule of law. The question for us, I think, is why are liberal candidates sometimes losing to illiberals like Donald Trump? What has happened here? That's the practical question that brings us to Williamsburg, it seems like to me. And Sheri has already covered some of the original kind of arguments that explain why liberals are losing elections. There's the economic insecurity argument. According to this argument, a lot of people are suffering more than they ever have from escalating economic insecurity. And as a result, especially among people who lack a higher education, these people's bigotry is being inflamed. They're getting mad at immigrants. They're getting mad at ethnic minorities. They're resentful about the empowerment of women and ethnic minorities and immigrants. And as a result, they are turning to politicians who reject liberal values entirely, and even democracy, people like Trump. You know what? If we look at the numbers, there's just no basis in the numbers for this. I actually kind of believed this too until I started looking into it. And I'm just recapping what Sheri said here. There really is no economic crisis in the West. Look, it's always the economy to some extent in politics. But, there's no greater economic crisis these days than there used to be. We hear about rising economic inequality. Yeah, inequality has grown, but has it grown at a rate that actually would endanger democracy? We see here that the American economy was growing when Trump was elected to office, unemployment was falling, and what's called the Gini score, which is the measure of socioeconomic inequality, was growing. It grew from 35 to 42 in that scale that's measured, that the Gini coefficient is measured on, over the last 40 years or so. That's movement in the wrong direction. But it's not the kind of movement that I would expect to actually jeopardize democracy. Let's look at Europe for a second. I'm just going to actually, before we do that, let's take another look at the United States. People talk about subjective perceptions of economic insecurity. Okay, so maybe the economy isn't turned down that badly, but if people feel less secure, if they feel less secure in their jobs, or they like their jobs less, maybe in fact that could explain why they're turning to miscreants like Trump. If we actually look at data from the General Social Survey, we don't find all that much basis for this argument. In fact, there's been no decline in subjective perceptions of job security among people who lack a college education over the last 40 years in these data. You can see it in the graph on the left. There's a survey question that asks people, how hard would it be for you to find a job that provides as well as the one you've got now? And what we see is over time, there's been no overall decline in people's perceptions of job security. What about quality of employment? That matters too, right? And the standard story that we oftentimes hear, and that people from Elizabeth Warren to Donald Trump oftentimes purvey, there's this notion that, back in the good old days, working class people could count on getting a good job, a union job in the coal mine or in the steel mill shortly after high school graduation. They'd hold that job until they're ready to retire. It'd have good benefits, a living wage, and they could be sure of job security. And these days, all these poor, humiliated men have been forced to take off their Kevlar gloves and put on aprons, and instead of asking how many tons of steel, boss, it's how much, room for cream. So everybody's working at Starbucks, and now instead of working in the steel mill, and somehow that's taken a real hard toll on people's morale. Actually, there's been no decline in job satisfaction among people who lack a college education in the United States over the last 40 years. You can see that in the graph. What about Europe? Okay, have things actually been a lot worse in Europe? Well, the UK is one country where we're having a discussion that's pretty similar to what we're having in the United States about Trump. The reason, of course, is Brexit. And there, a lot of observers have said, well, it must be that these so-called, in Britain, they're called left-behinds, right? These working-class people from the predominant ethnic group, from white Brits, they feel like their job security has gone down. They're suffering from these cultural resentments as well. Well, if we actually look at the data for the British economy, overall, and these big macroeconomic indicators certainly are not everything, but what we see is that the British economy was actually growing, and unemployment was falling very fast in Britain at the time of the Brexit vote. What about a rise in inequality? Well, over the last 40 years, the Gini score in Britain has gone from 27, one of the lowest in the world, which means inequalities are the lowest, among the lowest in the world, to 31, still one of the lowest in the world. It's really hard to find the basis for working class rage in these figures. So no wonder there was actually no correlation between one's occupation and voting for Brexit. Working class Brits, people who work in manufacturing industries, as well as the unemployed, were no more likely to vote for Brexit than were people who do not fit that description. What about two other countries? We could actually say this of all the countries that are where democracy is under threat right now. But the big countries where democracy is under threat include India and Poland. What about in Poland? Poland has authored the post-communist world's most impressive economic success story. Poles have seen their incomes go up by 250% over the last 25 years. Poles did not even suffer in the financial crisis of the late 2000s, and yet they have authored one of the post-communist world's most spectacular cases of reversion to authoritarianism. And by the way, this growth has occurred under conditions of equality. Poland's Gini score, which is that measure of inequality, is the same as Sweden's, it's 29. What about India? In India, people have seen their incomes quadruple over the last 30 years. India is the world's greatest economic success story, along with China, of the last half century. Indians' life expectancy has shot up. Everything's getting better for most people, almost everybody in India, over the last 3 decades, and yet India has also authored a case of reversion, not to full-blown authoritarianism, but what many people see as a real movement in the direction of democracy's degradation. In other words, as economies boom, look at who we get. On the left, you see Miroslav Kaczynski, who's the kind of leader of the illiberal party, the so-called Law and Justice Party in Poland, and there's Narendra Modi, the leader of the BJP, this ethno-nationalist party that now rules in India. Okay, so maybe it's culture. Sheri talked about this as well. If it's not the economy, maybe people's bigotry is on the rise. They feel their cultural, their views on cultural matters aren't respected anymore. Oftentimes, people talk about status anxiety with especially men from the predominant ethnic group, especially non-college educated folks, feeling that their values and their status are actually under threat. Well, is that actually true? It's possible, but around the world, what we see is not people moving toward more intolerant positions, but just the opposite. People are actually getting more tolerant. Sheri pointed this out in our proceedings yesterday, and it's true. I'm just going to take a couple of data points here to illustrate what I'm trying to say. In the United States, when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson muscled the Fair Housing Act through Congress, that's the law that told owners that they couldn't discriminate based on race if they wanted to rent or sell their properties, right? Well, at the time the law was passed, most Americans were very much against this law. And even 10 years later, in 1978, the first year for which we've got data, actually, no, we've got data for, good, we've got data all the way back to 1970. So what we see here, it doesn't go back to 68, is about 35% of Americans favored that law at the time, the law that would force owners to rent or sell to people regardless of their race. Over time, that number doubles by these days. That's obviously a case of liberalization. What about this question? There's another really interesting question in the General Social Survey. Should a homosexual man be allowed to teach in college? 40 years ago, half of Americans answered that question no. Now just about everybody else, everybody answers that question yes. And these are global trends. The World Values Survey, which is that wonderful survey that Ronald Inglehart and his colleagues have done for us for the last 40 years or so, has data from all over the world on a lot of different social and cultural questions. And what they find is there's an overall trend toward liberalization of social attitudes in the world. It's not universal. It doesn't happen at the same pace everywhere. But over the last 40 years or so, Inglehart and Norris detect what they call a silent revolution in values. And that silent revolution is all about liberalization of values. And you see here, this is just attitudes on homosexuality. You can trace any country you want there. India's a little bit different, but other countries' populations seem to be evolving, as progressives like to say, right? Well, Inglehart and Norris, though, they have a new argument. They've got a new book out that's called Cultural Backlash. And even though their data show this liberalizing trend in the world, they still see cultural backlash as to blame for the rise of the Trumps, the passage of Brexit, and things like that. Their argument is subtle, and it's worth taking a closer look at. Their argument is basically the following. Once societies reach a certain kind of level of liberalism, and there's a tip over into the point at which conservative people kind of lose their cultural hegemony, to use language that Inglehart and Norris use in their work. Once they lose their cultural hegemony, they get really angry and really kind of crazy, and they throw in the towel on democracy. They go out and vote for people like Trump or vote for things like Brexit, all right? So that's possible, but I think there are real problems with this tipping point argument. First of all, there's this question of, how could it be that a declining number of people have more political clout than the numbers that they had before their numbers started to decline? So, for example, let's take the data on immigration, right? The data on immigration show that in 2001, that a large majority of people were in favor of reducing overall immigration rates, right? These days, only 24% of people want to reduce immigration, and a crushing majority actually want to increase or hold immigration at the same level. Now, according to the logic of their argument, I don't have a pointer here, but those 53% of people who were in favor of decreasing immigration before would have less political clout than 24% do who actually favor reducing immigration right now. Which is to say that the intensity of preference on the part of conservatives would actually have to outweigh the growth in intensity in its political effects would have to outweigh the diminution in numbers of conservatives. The idea that somehow the 24% of people who favor reducing immigration rates today have more political clout, just because they're angrier, I suppose, than the 53% that wanted to reduce immigration before, strikes me as implausible. What's more, when do we know when conservatives have lost their cultural hegemony? When do we know when we've hit that tipping point? Is it when Inglehart and Norris suggest that it was in this current decade of Trump and Brexit? Or was it in the mid-1980s when a majority of people, let's look at race, tipped over into favoring equal housing? Was it back in the early 1960s when a majority of people actually tipped over into being in favor of integrated schools? And can we really say that the culture wars that Inglehart and Norris talk about in their book wage more strongly now, and that white anxiety and anger about African American empowerment is greater right now in the age of Colin Kaepernick than it was in the age of Medgar Evers in the 1960s? would we really say that, the Trump era is a tipping point in attitudes? It's really hard for me to find where the tipping points are. It seems like conservatives are always, almost by definition, losing their cultural hegemony, right? So Engelhardt and Norris say, and I cite this book and discuss it at length because it's such a good book, and it actually has had a big impact. In their explanation for Brexit, they say this following thing. But I think what we see here is the danger of inferring cause from effect, because they find no evidence in the data of a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment among people who voted for Brexit. In fact, they see a decline in anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK, and yet, since everyone assumes that Brexit passed because of rising anti-immigrant feeling in the population, they say the following thing, okay? Well, it's possible that the xenophobic sectors who endorse their values of, as a form of collective security to protect us against them was the reason why Brexit passed. But is it possible that the vast majority of people who voted for Brexit really actually were not seeking collective security to protect us against them, but rather they were just, nostalgic for politicians, liberal politicians, who made them feel really great about being Brits, not just about being Europeans or members of the LGBT community. And is it surprising that when the voices of kind of optimistic liberal nationalists like these wane, that the pessimistic prattle of these pseudo-patriots like these guys comes to the fore? Similarly, is it surprising that when the voices of, progressive liberal nationalists, like three of these guys you see here, and a conservative liberal nationalist as well on your far right, wane, that the voices of the kind of apocalyptic whining of characters like this comes to the fore in the United States? So what I want to argue is that liberals need to start finding better and new points of contact between themselves, liberal politicians, and the people in their own countries. And I want to suggest that one overlooked way of doing this is to actually return to casting progressive causes and democracy itself in nationalist terms. And this is our chance, our being liberals, okay? And by liberal, again, I mean Reagan to Bernie, all right? This is an era in which the Republican Party, having reached this stage of illiberalism now, where Republicans are actually opposing democratic institutions, they have done that at the same time that they've outed themselves as lacking in patriotism. This is liberals' chance to seize back the flag and reclaim their status as a party as the patriotic party that they haven't had since the Vietnam War. When I talk to people back home, I'm from Kentucky, about why they supported Trump, almost nobody tells me that the Democrats have just kind of left us behind economically, right? Nobody says that. What I hear from everybody is Democrats don't love America enough. What I hear from them is Democrats are wimps. They're not decisive, right? Or they're unethical. I never hear anything about the economy. I actually think we need to take that under advisement. This is our chance. Look, all these illiberal politicians in Europe as well are selling out to transnational criminal forces, and especially to Vladimir Putin's regime. And I think in order to go further than just impeaching Trump on the basis of legal violations, or prosecuting people like Salvini in Europe for having taken 8-figure sums from Putin, we need to leverage their betrayal of country to demolish their argument that they're better patriots than we are. And for inspiration, actually, look, here's the thing. These guys, these illiberal leaders, oftentimes get to power and stay in power by casting themselves as superior nationalists. They love Italy, they love the United States, they love France better than liberals do, all right? But actually, they don't anymore, all right? What we have here is illiberal forces actually selling out to a transnational force that is both opposed to liberalism and the interests of the countries that they actually govern. So for insight into what to do, and for inspiration, we might want to look back to the guys who kind of established the hegemony of the global liberal idea back in that second third of the 20th century. These are the people that brought us Medicare, the destruction of fascism, the deterrence of Russian illiberalism, NATO, the welfare state, and most of the other good things that liberals defend these days. these leaders were liberal, what we might call liberal nationalists. They were progressives, to be sure, far more progressive than our leaders are today for the most part, our progressive leaders. But they wrapped their every cause in a kind of grand national vision of how the progressive aim in question, or democracy itself, would advance the interests of the nation. The opponents they faced looked a lot like the opponents we face these days, the illiberal opponents that they faced. So, okay, all right, I have to stop now. All right, let me say very quickly, it's not the economy. We're looking in all the wrong places, right? Liberal politicians are losing ordinary folks, not because they've abandoned their economic interests, but because they no longer make sense to them as defenders of national interests, okay? I've been told I gotta wrap it up, so I'll end there.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much. And I should have said at the beginning, we're very sorry that Professor Jose Casanova from Georgetown University has fallen ill, and so we wish him a speedy recovery. He really regrets he couldn't join us, but we had a little more time to go through the talks. I'm imagining we might have provoked a question or two, so for anyone who would like to ask, we have staff members with microphones, and let me take this opportunity to thank the staff at the Reves Center, Kate Hoving, Diane Alleman, Tyler Lawrence, all of them, and our whole staff have been just terrific in putting this event together. So who would like to ask the first question? Here's one over here.
Thank you. This is for Steve. Steve, when you were discussing the I'm not going to discuss the United States because I don't think what I'm about to say would apply there. But with regard to homosexuality, you listed countries in which, with the exception of South Africa and India, but where it's quite well known that they've had increasing tolerance for a long time. You didn't list most of Africa. You didn't list the Middle East. You didn't list former Soviet Union, including Russia, where it has actually been an issue used very prominently by Putin and so forth. If you subscribe to the liberal values of the EU, it'll mean that there are all kinds of gays coming and attacking your children and that sort of thing. So I wonder whether just by listing that fairly limited number of countries, you may have overestimated the extent to which there really is growing tolerance.
It's possible, Mark, but actually, if you look at the numbers, even for Russia, even for some Middle Eastern countries, you do see, I mean, levels of intolerance are much higher, of course, than they are in the West. But for the most part, the movement that you see is in what we would consider to be the right direction, right? And it's true that leaders like Putin try to play on popular, homophobic sentiments to try to cast themselves as people of the people. But even there, it seems like things are moving in the right direction. My only argument here is that you can't ascribe the growth and popularity of illiberal politicians to the growth of illiberal sentiment among ordinary people. Even in Russia, I don't see that in the numbers, including on homosexuality.
We have a question over here.
I won't dispute whether or not economics is at the bottom of all things. But none other than the former president of the United States wrote that in 1980, the top 1% of the population received 7% of income, whereas today they receive about 20 to 21% of it. So the American economy may have actually gone through the roof in the last 40 years, but the distribution of that growing income, again, by the President of the United States doesn't seem to have been as equal as your graphs have suggested. And I also just looked at, to verify that I knew it right, that wages have been basically stagnant in the last 3 to 4 decades. How do you square those with the picture, with the...
Yeah, I mean, look.
We'll need to wait for the microphone, Giancarlo. Can we bring a microphone up here? Kelly, if you could just run up there. Sorry, and thank you, Kelly, for your staff support as well.
I was really surprised by this simple and, if you want, naive presentation of the global available income for families. You have to separate, you have to divide, you have to distinguish between different levels of salary, of income. The global available income doesn't mean anything, doesn't explain anything in politics, because depends on the equality index. Depends, beyond the global available income of family, you have different level of remuneration and of income that are explaining why there is so much complaining, because the issue of the salary, the different level of salary, the higher level of salary have been a bit increasing, but at the same time, the average salary has been remained the same of 73.
So maybe those two for Steve?
Look, it depends on how you slice the numbers. But look. Yeah, I mean, look, these are the numbers. In 1979, on the verge of the Reagan Revolution, the Gini coefficient in the United States for after-tax and transfers income was 35, right? It's 42 today. Now, that is a rise. That's a movement in the wrong direction. In terms of wealth inequality, things have gotten worse, right? In 1980, the top 1% owned 24% of national wealth. This year, it's 39%. That's a big rise in the wrong direction. I'm not disputing that there's been a rise in inequality. What I'm asking you is, could that possibly explain the degradation of democracy? Democracy threatening revolt. Look, during the Great Depression, unemployment ran at 25%. Life expectancy fell by 5 years, and the Gini score was over 50, and democracy sailed through. I'm not saying that there hasn't been a rise in inequalities. What I'm saying is that does not necessarily explain. Liberals, progressives are very fast to jump on this. We always ascribe democracy's problems to rising inequality, to the point where we even blame liberal politicians like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair or Barack Obama for selling out to neoliberalism and causing all these inequalities. And we even blame them for the rise of Trump. I just don't agree with this. I mean, inequalities have grown in the United States, but not that much. What's more, if we look at other countries, if we look at Europe, there's been no rise in inequality. We see the rise of the AfD and other ethno-national parties around Europe. But in Europe, the Gini scores haven't changed in 30 years, right, for most countries. So you can find cases of rising inequality. I'm just asking if we can really attribute the rise of fascists to those numbers. My argument is that progressives in a knee-jerk way do that, but I'm just asking us to question those assumptions.
There's a question back here.
What would it look like if, in fact, the liberals tried to look as if they love their country more? Everyone is using the flag as wallpaper now on both the Democratic and the Republican side. How much more flag raising is going to be effective when that really is a superficial kind of behavior? How does one say, I love my country, and then proceed from there to convince someone of that?
It's a really good question. It's not just a matter of hoisting the flag. It's a matter of telling a national story, embedding your progressive causes and your defense of democracy in a national story about what's good for the nation, right? These, liberal politicians like John Kennedy and FDR and Lyndon Johnson, and for that matter, Nehru and Martin Luther King and Harold Macmillan used to do this instinctively. This just came instinctually to them. If you wanted to make a case for a social program, if you wanted to make the case for democracy, you wrapped it in a grand story about what was good for the nation, what was good for America, what was good for Germany. These politicians did this instinctively. Frankly, these politicians don't. What we hear from them is, argument after argument that vilifies the 1% and that talks about the forgotten working person, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, and I'm a progressive, I would be in favor of policies that stick it to the 1%, right? The question is whether you run your election campaigns and form your rhetoric around strictly class-based issues, or whether actually turning to the nation might actually help liberals connect more with ordinary folks and win over just a slice of that vote that we're going to need in order not only to kick Trump out of office, but to destroy Trumpism.
I want to make sure if there are questions for any other panelists, we should probably also get those. And then we're going to wrap up because we only have a couple minutes. So there's one back here.
I'd like the panel to talk a bit about the European Union, which I think could be argued as the second great experiment in multiculturalism. And also as a corollary to that, the British, or more, perhaps one should be more specific, the English have always been reluctant Europeans. Might European integration move faster once the Brits are out? I have my wife's side are Danish, and I'm really struck by the young people, such as those that are here today, who think of themselves as equally European as they do Danish, which after all is an ancient kingdom. And when I talk to them, I think sometimes when they have more in, my Danish nephew, grandnephew actually, has more in common with his Italian counterpart than I did at his age with as a New Yorker with somebody from Mississippi.
So the European Union is an incredible experiment. It is indeed unprecedented. It is an attempt to sort of go beyond the nation state-based order that we've had for several hundred years. I mean, the issue with the European Union that I think is causing a lot of friction and obviously played the key role in Brexit is the sort of discrepancy between the amount of power that the EU has and the amount of control citizens have over how that power is exercised, right? So it's not a question of whether you're for or against the EU, it's a question of focusing on the discrepancy between how much governing actually happens at the EU level and how much control citizens of various European countries have over that. Ostensibly, at least, that was, again, the key issue in the Brexit debate, the fear or the concern that, you know, EU technocrats, whatever, were making decisions that had immense distributional consequences on the lives of British, and in particular, as you note, English citizens, because that's where the real opposition to the EU was in the British, you know, on the British Isles, and the fact that they just did not feel that they had control over what those decisions were. And that is largely correct. And so the question then becomes is how uncomfortable you are with that. The second part of your question is also notable. It is indeed true that if you look at survey data, young folks feel more European than older folks do. That's not surprising, both because they have more opportunity to travel. Lots of students will spend, you know, the equivalent of a semester abroad at different European universities. They learn languages now much earlier. And so it's much easier for them to feel a kinship with folks outside of their borders than it would have been for their parents or grandparents to do so. Now, by the time that Europeanness catches up to the level of power that exists at the European Union and is translated, therefore, perhaps into growing pressure for more democracy and control at the European level, I mean, one hopes, if one is an EU fan, that that happens relatively quickly, because the discrepancy that now exists between the level of economic integration and the level of political integration is only likely to continue to cause friction until that gap is kind of changed.
I think the last question will be up here. I believe, yes, a very patient person.
Hi. My question would be like for the first panelist on NATO and like the liberal order, because many NATO nations have been saying have been falling into illiberal regimes, Poland, Hungary, and Turkey. Moving forward, how as a collective defense organization do we deal with the balance between requiring these nations close to former Soviet states and balancing against Russia's sphere of influence while also trying to promote democracy and free speech and human rights that are being trampled on in these nations?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. So, you know, NATO has always had elements of illiberalism in it. I mean, Turkey, as was mentioned by Jenny, has not always been, or maybe mostly has not been a liberal regime, but has been a member for a long time. It is a collective security alliance, so first and foremost, it's about collective defense, not necessarily about democracy and liberalism, although there have been some assumptions in NATO's organization that the two would go hand in hand. And indeed, I would say there's been some reinforcement of, you know, democratic values in the NATO alliance, certainly during the Cold War because the opposition was communist. But, you know, your question is a very acute one really right now for NATO, because if it weren't for the fact that Russia keeps overstepping, I think there would be really serious questions about the durability of the alliance. Russia has a habit of, just when everybody's thinking, well, we really don't have anything in common, you know, someone dies of poisoning on a British street, you know, or Dutch plane is shot down over Ukraine. And these kinds of moments keep occurring in a way that keeps the alliance thinking, okay, there actually is a threat that we are all very serious about. Members like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and many of the new members in Central and Eastern Europe do continue to feel a very acute threat coming from Russia, and they often, galvanize other older NATO members, ironically, to be more oriented toward that. I do think the question of how you move from a situation in which the U.S. was always the primus inter pares in these settings. I mean, essentially, when the U.S. said behind closed doors, this is what has to happen, it typically did. And the requirement to buy defense products that were interoperable with other NATO countries and not have purchase of anti-aircraft missiles from Russia, for example. When those norms break down, as in many cases of norm breakdown that we've talked about, actually domestically as well as internationally, it's very difficult to get them back together. Even if a new president of the United States were elected for the sake of argument, who is more committed to liberal internationalism in the classical sense, alliance structure, a kind of General Mattis-style support of allies, I think it'd be very difficult for such a person to get the same degree of automatic consensus among NATO members. And we're going to see very soon, I think, how much solidarity remains vis-a-vis Russia's foreign policy goals in particular, and also China. China's role in subsidizing and supporting Belt and Road Initiative in ways which are very enticing to many European states, Italy being an example. These are all factors that are sort of there in the background. And again, as I said at the beginning, we're not yet at the point where that structure's disappeared. It's still there and it still matters to a lot of people. But let's face it, when you add up all of those different kinds of tensions and underlying factors that are coming together, it will take, I will say this for sure, it'll take a lot of effort by anyone interested in rebuilding that set of norms to do it fairly quickly. And if it falls apart, it falls apart. I mean, one thing we know about collective action internationally is that once you don't have an alliance, it's not like you can call everybody up after it's gone and say, wasn't that a good idea? We really should have British and French and German cooperation for security purposes, let alone Estonian and Turkish. So on that note, I have to cut myself off. It's now 3:28. I hope you enjoyed this very lively exchange. It was wonderful to see so many of you, and thanks to the panelists.